I get asked all the time, why does my broadcast mix sound so bad? And I understand. Sometimes it can sound great in the room, but you listen back online and it sounds like a dumpster fire. So here are 5 things that are keeping your broadcast mix sounding bad, and then we'll talk about solutions for those so that you can make it sound as good online as it does in the room. Hey, if you're new here, my name is James and I help worship leaders, sound techs, and tech directors make the most out of their sound system by eliminating the mystery and frustration with sound at church. If that's you, you found the right place, go ahead and mash that subscribe button. The very first thing that might confuse you as to why it sounds so different online than in the room is the vocal pitch center. Now, that's the polite way of saying that the vocals sound like they're out of tune or a little bit sharp or a little bit flat, and that is absolutely normal to hear when you have a great live performance and then you listen back to it on a little phone speaker or a laptop or a TV. Singing is really difficult, and we've gotten accustomed to hearing recorded vocals that are tuned perfectly. And believe me, for 5 years, I did this a lot in manually tuning vocals so that they sounded awesome and natural, and it was a lot of work, but a lot of fun because I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. But the thing is, in your live performances, you might have great singers that sound amazing in the room, but when you listen back on a broadcast, it's like somebody's taken a little microscope and figured out what little percentage they're off, and it's like, it feels really bad. So when it sounds kind of cringy online, and forgive my language, I mean, singers have a hard job and they don't have any frets, they don't have a tuner, and they're doing it live. Like, I have all the grace in the world for singers, but let's be honest, sometimes it sounds cringy online and it's really difficult to overcome. Why does it sound good in the room and why doesn't it sound good online? Well, in the room, I have a couple theories as to why it sounds fine. The first one is that the reverb in the room kind of covers over little discrepancies or scoops or bends from the pitch, because we're not just hearing all the vocal right at once, that it's really dry and just like straight from the microphone. We're hearing it bounce off a bunch of different surfaces, and if there's some waver in the pitch, then we're hearing the pitch right now, and we're hearing the pitch from a few milliseconds ago, and it all kind of gets blended into one, so our brain kind of interprets that as right in the middle of the pitch. Another factor is that in the room, you have a lot of other people singing melody along with the worship leader. This contributes to another factor that we'll talk about later, but when you have a bunch of other people that are singing maybe not quite in the middle of the pitch, in the room, it sounds fine if the person singing on stage isn't quite exactly in the middle of the pitch. It's not like at church we're sitting there quietly, intently listening to the vocal performance and that's it. We're participating, we're singing along, and so are the people around us. So it makes it a lot easier to cover those little tiny mistakes. So when I recommend for churches to add vocal tuning to part of their technical repertoire, it's not because they have bad singers, it's because online doesn't have any of those things that cover up the vocal pitch. And it doesn't make a bad singer good, but it can make a singer that's got a little bit less precise pitch control feel like they're closer to the center of the pitch, and it's just less distracting. You might still think of it as cheating, and that's okay. If you don't want to do it, nobody's going to make you, but I guarantee that your live broadcast will sound a lot better if you add tuning to your vocals. If you want to know how, there are several ways, and depending on your console, it might shift a little bit, but I'll put a link to some of those videos down in the description below. The second big problem that we run into with why your broadcast might sound bad is the dynamic range, or the difference between the loud and the quiet parts. When we're gathered in the same room, we often want to feel big contrasts between the loud part and the quiet part. And our ears adapt to that and it feels good, especially when we're in a big room and we've got a big sound system that can pump out the bass. But when you try to translate that into a little speaker where there's not a lot of people singing along, there's not a lot of people to absorb the energy, and our speakers might not sound that great when we crank it up, that means that the loud parts we keep at a lower volume. So when the volume comes down from the loud parts that we had live, then the parts that are quiet and still understandable in the room get too quiet when we're listening online. Now, this is apparent both in the music sections, when the loud and the quiet parts of the music, and in the speaking parts versus the music parts. I mean, if you've ever gotten an email saying, I can hear the worship, but I couldn't hear the preaching, you can go ahead and mash that thumbs up. The other part of dynamic range that makes it tricky to get it loud enough online is the transients from the drums. In a live environment, the transients from the drums provide a lot of impact, and it gives us that big feeling that we really like about having live music. It also has a lot of bass, so it feels really good. The problem is that those spikes and transients are a lot higher level than the average levels that we listen for when we're perceiving loudness. To put it another way, drums can measure a lot higher on a peak meter than the instruments and voices that make us feel like something is loud enough. The problem we run into is that the digital signal that we're broadcasting over the internet can only take so much dynamic range, and when the peaks from the drums are taking up a lot of the top of that dynamic range, we push stuff up, but then it starts to clip. We see red lights, we hear distortion, and then we turn it down. The problem is then on the other end, people say it's too quiet and I can't hear. So that puts us in a pinch. Do we turn it up so that it's loud enough but it's clipping? Or do we make it so that it's not distorting and people can't hear? Now, granted, this is some people who might not have the sound system or the ability to turn it up enough, but personally, I don't love turning up my TV to 90%. That's really scary for me because I know something is going to come through and it's going to be really loud and jump out at me. So I try to avoid that, but we need to try to get our levels up, and the transients on the drums are not our friend in that situation. The third problem that you run into with having a bad sounding broadcast mix is the balance between the music and the vocals. This relationship between the vocal and how connected it feels to the band is called the vocal pocket. And for many studio mixers, it's a tricky one to get right, and even for many pro studio engineers, they will send different versions of a song with the vocal up and vocal down to the mastering engineer to see what feels best on the other end. If we have the vocal too far out in front, or we're so concerned with it being the most prominent thing in the mix that we push it up so that it's very loud and clear, then people who are listening on a device like a phone or something with small speakers are going to get a lot of vocal and not a lot of support from the music. On the flip side, and I rarely see this happening, is people will pull the vocal so far back that it's not intelligible with the energy of the music. And I rarely hear this happening, but you need to watch out for it when you're going the other direction from trying to not make it feel like it's just the vocal and no music is supporting it. This particular thing gets very tricky, especially when we have the dynamic range of the band going up and down, but the dynamic range of the vocals isn't quite as different from, say, the guitars going from really quiet to really loud. When we have our live mix, we want all that dynamic range where the instruments get really loud and we still have the vocal there, to where the instruments come down and they're really quiet. We like that kind of change, and it provides a lot of interest when we're there in the room, but on a broadcast, it totally messes with the perception of that mix. It's like it's a moving target all the time. The fourth reason your broadcast mix probably sounds bad is that you're not monitoring the proper way. And being able to listen to the mix and be able to make good judgments is a really critical thing if you really want to dial in your broadcast mix. One thing that drives me bananas when I'm trying to mix live and mix for the broadcast is switching back and forth, putting headphones on or in-ears on, because in-ears isolate a little bit better, but I kind of get into the world of the broadcast mix, and then I take off my headphones at front of house and I hear the room again, and I'm like, this is so different, this is so out of context, or the feeling that I'm getting from this same set of inputs, so different that it throws me off, and I really don't love it. It's kind of jarring for me. Now, I mentioned already I prefer in-ears sometimes to headphones because in-ears give me more isolation, right? I'm not hearing, and I'm still feeling, but I'm not hearing all the low end or all the noise that's coming from the PA or the drum kit that's in the room when I pop in those in-ears. I get a little bit more isolation. What I don't get, though, is isolation from the tactile response from the low end of the room, right? When I feel the low end, I'm getting that from the PA. I'm not getting that from my in-ear monitors. So that could throw me off in just how much low end is coming through the broadcast mix versus what's happening at front of house. Now, I have heard from some churches that will try to monitor off of the YouTube broadcast or whatever other service that they're using, and there is some latency between what they're hearing and the mix adjustments that they're making. And if you could imagine driving a car or a bus with that kind of delayed response, you might not be happy with the results. I don't want you to get into that pinch, so please don't accept a high latency monitoring situation as acceptable. Work harder to figure out something else where you can hear what's happening and the changes that you're making in much closer to real time. Now, if you've gone through the effort to setting up a separate room to mix your broadcast in, sometimes you still might not be getting great results because the acoustics in your room might be really lousy and they could be coloring the way that you're hearing so that you're going to make reciprocal adjustments to the mix based on what the acoustics are telling you. Now, I realize I just used some big words, so what do I mean by that? I mean that if your room is very boomy, and your speakers are maybe up against the wall or in a corner, you're getting a lot of bass out of those speakers that might not be actually present in your mix at the same proportion to the mid-range. What that makes you do is you turn down the bass levels until they feel right, but then everywhere else, now it sounds thin. So if your monitors are thick, your mix will be thin. If your monitors are super bright, you're going to hear all that top end and think, ooh, that's too much. And you're going to make things a lot duller so that on anybody else's speaker, on average, things are going to feel a little bit more muffled and maybe even less intelligible. The final thing that makes it really hard for you to get a great broadcast mix is that it's difficult to control. And what I mean by that is if you have 32 faders of input channels at front of house, and then you have to go to a pre-fader aux send and mix all of those again, you're having to reinvent the wheel with your balance on all of those channels that's going to your broadcast mix. Even if you have a post-fader mix, which tracks the changes that you make on the front of house faders to be reflected in your broadcast. So, you pull the guitar down at front of house, it also goes down to the broadcast mix. You push the piano up on front of house, it also goes that way to the broadcast mix. That's a better way of doing it, but even when you're making changes and making little adjustments for what's going to fit well for your broadcast mix, having individual channels is a lot more difficult than, say, having groups that you can adjust. Perhaps you've got an entire second setup, but that also requires a second person to run it. And if you're like most churches, you're probably a little bit short on qualified audio people that aren't already in the rotation at front of house. So enough problem talk, let's talk about solutions. For vocal tuning, I highly recommend setting up tuning and doing it in a way that makes it easy to bypass in case something fails. And yes, computers will fail, so you need to have an easy way to bypass those tuning plugins. Another solution that solves several problems at once, like our dynamic range, dealing with transients, and getting the vocal instrument balance just right, is using buses or groups to compress each type of channel together before it goes to the main output for your broadcast. When we group all of our drums into a bus and send that bus just to the broadcast, we can compress those drums in a way that tames the transients that are going to make our peak meters spike up and keep our levels low. We can also compress the very dynamic instruments so that when they get loud, we push those down, and when they get quiet again for front of house, the level comes back up so that it's more consistent, and that means that our vocal band balance, or our vocal pocket, is a lot easier to stay consistent as well. Finally, these buses make our mix decisions a lot easier when we're transitioning back and forth from headphones or in-ears at front of house to make sure that the balance is right. We just have to think about, okay, how are my drums feeling? How are my instruments feeling? And how are my vocals feeling? If you can balance those three things, it's a lot easier than balancing 32 faders on something. The final pro tip that I'll give you is that if you're having to mix in headphones and you have a stereo send, I recommend still mixing those headphones most of the time in mono. And why do I recommend mixing them in mono? Well, the vocal pocket is actually really difficult to mix in headphones because the stuff on the sides of your mix is so far out, it can make it difficult to gauge that difference in level. And in headphones, you can hear so much detail that it makes it really hard to distinguish whether something is buried and you can still hear it because you're hearing every detail, or if it's too far out in front. So when you mix in mono in headphones, you just park that vocal just on top of the mix, and then every once in a while you can check it in stereo, but most of the time this works well to make sure that your vocal is not too far out in front. Now, it can also be easy to mix in your background vocals too high, so you've got to watch out for that, especially if you're mixing in headphones. It's hard to tell. When in doubt, tuck them back just a little bit more. So we've covered a lot, and this is by no means a comprehensive step-by-step plan for how to get your broadcast mix dialed in. But if you want that comprehensive step-by-step plan, I'd highly encourage you to sign up for Attaway Audio Academy and take the broadcast mixing course. This walks you through all the theory, all the setup, and all the different mixing decisions that you have to make in order to get your broadcast up and running, and learning how to fine-tune it along the way so that you create a system that works well for volunteers at front of house or at a separate digital audio workstation. You can sign up for that at attawayaudio.com/academy or find the link down in the description below. If you're not ready to jump into that yet, you can download my free guide, How to Lead Your Church Audio Stream Team, and you can find that link down in the description below as well. As always, remember, it's all about the low end, avoid the sound tech solo, and nobody leaves church humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.